Welcome back. This video will cover Learning Objective 1.2 for Chapter 1 for PSY 235 Social Psychology. In this section of the chapter, you'll be learning about how and why people work so hard to explain and make sense of their own and other people's social interactions, or their individual thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Remember how I said in the last video that we're going to spend an awful lot of time talking about the process of construal and making sense of the world that is around us. So that will be a major focus of this part of the chapter. We'll start with a simple example, and this is a silly example, but I'll play you this video. The video is of a student project from, heavens, probably a decade ago, where a simple manipulation in the environment shows just how vulnerable we are to the process of social influence. Now the video quality here isn't great, but what the student did in their little social psychology experiment was to put a sign on the glass between the two doors, pointing to one door being the door for males and the other door being the door for females. And she posted this sign on both sides. And what happened, it kind of surprises everyone. So there she switches to the female door without really questioning it, and then these two split up. The female goes through the female door, the male goes through the male door. Without really questioning why they're doing what they're doing. They're just doing it, right? Now, in this case, the student was trying to demonstrate following kind of mindlessly social norms or rules in our social world, without really spending a lot of time unpacking why. So that's a funny example of how vulnerable we are to social influence on a pretty much everyday basis. So what is this thing called social influence? Basically, social influence is something that we approach scientifically in a way that's different than the approach taken by, say, philosophers, people who are writers who are trying to explain current events, or just the regular everyday person on the street. What social influence involves for us is the way in which people try to explain their situations, but they may not always be aware of exactly what is influencing them. So what we do is we construct theories, hypotheses, and then test those through experiments and other kinds of studies where we're manipulating variables to see what factors in the environment are actually having an impact on people's thoughts, feelings, and actions. Our goal is to identify variables, properties, rules, basically, that make us susceptible so strongly to social influence. Now, before we go forward, this idea of being susceptible to social influence is not always consistent with the way people in the Western world, like people in the United States, Canada, Western Europe, tend to see themselves. We tend to see ourselves as very independent, as acting in ways that are consistent with our internal traits and values. But the reality is we are very, very strongly shaped by the social environment that we land in. So as the cartoon says here, peer pressure is a real thing. It's a concrete example of how social influence works. To give you another example, I suppose we could have a whole psychology class on Florida man memes, because they just make us go, wow, why did they do that? I suppose the example, the entertaining example from this week for me is when that tech CEO and his side piece got caught at a Coldplay concert, where the lead singer, Chris Martin of Coldplay, catches them on the kiss cam and says, as they realize that they're on the camera, she covers her face and turns around, and he ducks down out of view of the camera. And the lead singer says, wow, they must be having an affair, or they're really, really shy. and there, that's an example of how everybody in that context was trying to make sense of why did these people do this? And they come up with an almost immediate explanation. So Chris Martin, when he sees these two people, he's like, okay, it's one of two things. Super shy people, or they're doing something naughty. It turns out they were doing something super naughty, and they're experiencing all kinds of consequences as a result. So our behavior does tend to be highly, highly influenced by our social context. And we have a strong tendency, to interpret people's behavior that we see. So whether it's this couple getting caught on the kiss cam, or this guy who's robbing a convenience store with a see-through bag over his head as a disguise, a lot of people would look at that and go, he's just not very smart. So you're interpreting it in terms of his traits and capabilities. We have a powerful tendency to assume people do what they do because of who they are. And what we often miss is all of the social context clues and cues that are pushing people to behave in specific ways. What we call this is the fundamental attribution error, and this will not be the last time that we talk about this. Basically, we have kind of a built-in bias that leans in the direction of assuming that people behave in ways that are consistent with their underlying personality traits, their underlying values, beliefs, and so on. And also their underlying levels of ability, things like intelligence or athleticism, and so on. So we have a tendency to be looking at the person and say, they did that because of who they are. So like Chris Martin on the stage with Coldplay is basically, you're either a cheater or you're shy, both of which are internal attributes to those people. So what we're doing there is underestimating the degree to which social influence has an impact on us. We tend to downplay for other people for the most part, especially people we don't know particularly well. We tend to underestimate the social situation. Why do we do that? We do it for a number of reasons, in part because of where our focus is. When we're looking at another person trying to explain their behavior, typically what's going on is we go, okay, here's this person and they did this behavior. Who are they that would make them behave that way? That helps us to feel confident that we understand other people. Most of the time we feel like we're pretty good judges of who and what people are, when in fact we're pretty crappy at it, to be honest. And that's one of the things you're going to learn across the course of this semester, is that we're just not very good judges of character. It takes big things for us to get it right. So we tend to feel like, if we see someone do something, bad, like cheating on their partner in public on the kiss cam, we tend to assume it's because they're bad people, right? And part of why we do this is so that we can look at ourselves and say, yeah, I would never do that because I'm a good person. So we tend to want to insulate ourselves when we see other people doing really unpleasant things, which I kind of feel like the entire universe of TikTok is built around this idea that we really want to see other people have bad outcomes, and enjoy it. And part of our enjoyment is being able to sit back and say, dude, I would never do that because I'm smart, kind, and respectable, and so on. So it gives us this false sense of security. In addition, there's some vulnerabilities that we might have to destructive social influences, because we can kind of get sucked in and lower our guard when we're engaged in social interactions. And then finally, when we don't appreciate fully how strong social influence is, we tend to oversimplify situations, and that can leave us blind to all the potential impacts that are surrounding us. Now, social situations are inherently subjective, meaning that every human being is an individual and will perceive social situations somewhat differently. Humans are sometimes described as sense-making or meaning-making creatures. We have this, great big brain, and we tend to live a long time, and we tend to create these networks of social connections with each other. That requires us to be very adept at making sense of ourselves, making sense of the world, making sense of the people we share that world with. So we're constantly interpreting what's going on around us. The idea is that each person is going to look at that world, the other people in it, just a bit differently, because there's never a clear objective reality. It's always through the lens of your own personal traits, your own attributes, your own sense of who you are. So how people will act in whatever the situation isn't going to be 100% caused by just the objective situation on the ground. Instead, it's going to be how they perceive it. So I was, I'm embarrassed to admit, but I was on TikTok while having my morning coffee this morning, and apparently there was some incident at a Beyonce concert where apparently a child who was at the concert screamed in horror over a bug, and it caused a stampede. Now, luckily, based on the account that I saw, no one died, but there were injuries because people just stormed. They thought that the scream indicated there was danger and they had to flee. And video of it was, pretty shocking. It was like a flood of people, and the flood was so fast they broke the escalator, and then people started sliding down the escalator. So one child's horror at a bug gets misinterpreted as a big emergency where people have to flee the scene. So the objective conditions on the ground, it was a little kid overreacting to an insect. The people around that child, the ones who saw the bug, correctly interpreted her as overreacting to the insect. Those who didn't see it thought the scream suggested there was something really, really bad going on. So you can see how people are constructing a very different sense of reality in response to that event. Now, we should clarify what we mean by the word social situation. Anytime you're in a situation, and this is the most obvious way of thinking about it, you're with other people. One or more other people are in your environment. It could also mean you thinking about interactions with other people, either in the past, in the present, or in the future. So social situation is broadly defined. It's real or imagined. Now, one strategy that people can take to help them perceive the social world somewhat more accurately and carefully or mindfully is to, when they're in the process of making an interpretation or constructing a sense of reality, then they need to ask some hard questions about the event, what your authors call the objective properties of the situation, and then look at the behaviors that are coming from those properties. And that can help us to clarify what we're seeing and what's occurring around us so that mistakes won't happen like what happened at the Beyonce concert. So basically, for social psychologists, construal is the critical construct that we start with. Construal kind of goes against some schools of thought, like behaviorism, for example. especially the more strict versions of behaviorism, like that proposed by Skinner, often called radical behaviorism, where just to understand any kind of behavior, you need to understand the preceding situation, so the variables that are around the organism before it happens, but more importantly, what are the positive and negative events that come after those specific behaviors? Are they reinforcing? Are they punishing? And so on. There's in radical behaviorism, there's really no need to get under the hood and talk about thinking or motivation or emotion. Now, there are elements of behaviorism, though, specifically that overlap with social psychology. Some people call it social cognitive theory, or especially the approach taken by Albert Bandura of mixing learning theory with the understanding that people make sense of stuff that goes on around them. And all of that goes on under the hood, where by that I mean in your mind. You're drawing conclusions, making interpretations that is going to have an impact on how you feel and what you think about, and so on. So behaviorism remains an influence. Definitely, if we were rewarded or punished for a behavior, it's going to have an impact on whether we do it again. Like in the classic social situation of you go out on a first date and the date's really nice. It's rewarding to go on that date. You'll probably go again. If instead it's a bad date and it was a punishing experience, you are not going to go again, right? Unless you just like having a bad time. Anyway, so we borrow some of those ideas from behaviorism, but we still really, really, really rely on this idea of construction. And that shows another influence. And this influence is a very old, partly philosophical approach called Gestalt psychology, where the importance is on the subjectivity of human experience, where even just in our basic perceptions, things that we see, hear, touch, and so on, can really be altered by the way we make sense of the stimuli that are coming in. Now, this influences social psychology because of this idea of construal, where the way we approach a situation, the mindset that we have going in, will dramatically impact our current interpretations of our own feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, other people's feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And what that leads to is this idea of the social situation and social interpretation being incredibly important to the understanding of human social behavior. So if you want to understand social influence, you have to start with the assumption that people are going to differ in their perceptions and interpretations of the social world. You've probably found yourself in the last few years in our political context going, I do not understand how those people see the world that way. And define those people any way you want to. You've had that thought in the last few years, I'm pretty sure. Social psychologists really put a lot of emphasis on this idea that individuals do see the world differently. There are obviously overlaps. People that we're more similar to, we tend to perceive and interpret social events more similarly, but not 100% of the time. So those perceptions and interpretations are really critical. So to review, this idea of construal refers to the idea that the world is interpreted, some might argue, as far as created by the individual. And we place a great deal of importance on how people make sense of their social worlds. The origins of the interpretations, and I think you'll see this once we get into our content chapters. So like chapter 2, we're going to do methodology. And after we get beyond that and we start looking at theories, you'll see that this idea of where do these interpretations come from that's going to be a critical element of every single chapter from here on out. Another concept that's important for us to think about as we go forward in this class is something called naive realism. We tend, and part of the reason we do this is so that we feel safe, secure, so that we feel like we understand ourselves and the world. You've probably noticed that some circumstances can make us make the world seem really, really scary. So, think back to the early days of the pandemic where you just didn't know what was going on. You didn't know what was true. Remember how anxiety provoking and just weird that was? The reason that felt anxiety provoking and weird was because we, human beings that is, really prefer to feel like we know what's going on. And we don't like it when we don't feel like we know what's going on. So our default position is to believe that the world can be accurately understood. And we tend to be overconfident in believing that we're good at it. Maybe this will surprise you, maybe not. We're actually not very good at it. We use what we have at our disposal to make the best guesses that we can. They may or may not be right. So, we're not particularly accurate. We're never done with the job of interpretation. We're constantly spinning and reinterpreting, interpreting again, so that we can make sense of the world. All the while, we assume that we're really good at it when we're not. So we rely on our perceptions of events. And even if the facts on the ground change, our overwhelming tendency is to defend our initial perceptions. So, for example, like you think that someone you know has been mean to you, and you infer that they were mean to you because of X, whatever that reason was. And then other people in your social circle try to tell you, no, that's not what happened. Our tendency, because we like to feel like we understand the world, is to be kind of dogged in our defense of our own interpretations of the facts as they stand. So we tend not to be particularly flexible in our thinking. You probably know some people who are really extreme in that tendency, and others who are a bit more fluid. But generally speaking, we like feeling like we know what's going on, and we would rather not get caught in a situation where we're proved to be wrong. Because what happens when you feel it's pointed out to you that you're dead wrong? You get embarrassed, you get angry, you get upset, and it doesn't feel good. We like feeling smart, consistent, kind. We like all to be seen as having lots of positive characteristics. Not, being shown to be wrong tends to be a hit to our self-esteem. So we tend to want to protect that. So that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 1.2.